thank you very much for inviting me to ERPIC's meetings, and I really appreciate it very much. It's a distinguished body of scholars and professionals, and as you may know and as you feel, at least I feel so, that there is a certain danger in inviting a currently serving ambassador as a guest speaker. As many of you know, this job, at times at least, consists of reiteration of quite well-known facts and positions and repetition of things that you have heard from many other sources and many other people. And my task is even more difficult here today because many of you had or are currently having the same knapsack on your shoulders as I am having. But I perceive the only edge I may have in order not to bore you this afternoon in two elements. One is that I shall assume an off-the-record approach, which comes not so much from my 20 years, as Mr. Chairman reminded me, 20 years experience in the Polish Foreign Service, as from the fact that I firmly believe that my own educational background, and in this case it is history, provides an angle by which current political issues may often be assessed in a much more non-biased manner and a non-biased perspective. And point number two is that I think that diplomacy itself has changed significantly, at least over the last decade. One could say that we have left the world of Talleyrand and Metternich, and we have firmly entered the WikiLeaks universe. That is to say that while the tools of classical diplomacy may not have been totally forgotten or discarded, the challenges of ever-changing social and information environment place much greater demands on a foreign policy executives, and not to mention the fact that the entire process has become much more global, and in many senses of the word global. These are the general conditions in which each post-Lisbon presidency operates. In such conditions also the Polish presidency is operating. Let me just give you the basic and I would say encyclopedic facts. A country of a size roughly that of Spain, country of 37 million people population, not counting those who live in the wide world. There is a famous question in the Polish lessons of geography at schools: please name the second largest Polish city, and the answer is Chicago. But I am not counting those, actually. The economic parameters of the holder of a presidency look at present encouraging. I will start with, just give you a few. The 2011 ratio of public debt versus GDP. This is something that is talked about in Europe as one of the classical parameters answering whether we do have a crisis or we don't have a crisis. As you know, Italy, to name one, has 114% ratio. Polish ratio is 53% and the tendency in the next 3 years is on a decline. The GDP annual growth, this is always difficult, depends what mood are you in and what rating agency you listen to at the moment. But apparently we seem to be doing about 3.7% plus. The view for the next year, which looks like a more difficult year, looks like about 3%. According to the European Global Analysis Center, Poland is now among the United Nations member states 22nd in the world. I was surprised to find that the United States is still #1 and China is still #2. The direct foreign investments, moderate, $10 billion this year. Used to be better, used to be over 20, but that shows the shortages of cash, or rather the uncertainty among the investors where and how to invest their money, annual inflation about 4%, unemployment, the classical European 11, which is an average of the EU, more or less. I'm not going to talk in detail about the presidency priorities. I know that thanks to ERPIC management, those of you who could receive the electronic versions of thick documents, two of them to be precise. One is the 18-month Polish-Danish Cypriot program, and another is a Polish presidency for the next 6 months. However, I will emphasize a couple of points that I think have a bearing on reading our environment, European environment mainly, and how we came to establish those principles and those priorities which we think are relevant for the EU at present. The initial list of priorities and the process took about 2 years to clarify which will be the national priorities, was published in July 2010. That means one year before assuming the presidency. We try to identify the external conditions of what is today called not so much the EU presidency, but some say EU management. After Lisbon, presidency has, as you know very well, lost some of its charm. Some I would say treated with a certain nostalgia that the political edge of running the EU has changed to a much more managerial approach. But perhaps even at that point, I would say that managing things at times is equally difficult than running them from a political perspective. Some factors that I will name some factors that I think influence the current presidency or the current presidencies. These are things that will shape our understanding of international surroundings and conditions that we operate in, not only during the Polish presidency, but I think for the entire trio, and most probably, maybe with certain changes, in the next trio, which, if I may remind you, will be Ireland, Greece, and Lithuania. Another interesting trio. Those factors that I'd like to concentrate on briefly is that each presidency needs to assess the internal political state of play within other member states. This is not of primary importance, but it is important. It is important to see what kind of political mood is within the 27. We observe a shift to the right, let's say in Finland or Sweden or in the Netherlands. We see the impact of elections. A classical case would be France, and I'm very happy to say that we are one of the few that managed to hold the elections, parliamentary elections, during the presidency 1 week ago. Not only the government won, which is an outstanding event in the history of Poland in the last 20 years. No government was able to survive after 4 years in power. This one has. But of course, one thing that it does, it makes the running of the government and the running of the presidency cheaper and much more efficient. The new faces would be those that have to learn from the beginning sometimes. In this case, the cabinet simply does the entire job as it had done prior to elections. Also, you have to take into account the internal tensions within each member state, because they can shift the balance of a dialogue on the Brussels level. When I say that, I have in mind Italy, which is an obvious case, or very recently, I would say, our southern neighbor Slovakia. This is a very interesting case in itself, because we have seen the collapse of the government because of a debate on assisting the financial facility, this big budget, the super budget of Europe. This simply created the internal pressure. These things have to be assessed, or at least tried to assess. Let me let me say that I always repeat that we have learned from our predecessors. We have talked to countries holding the presidency since we are the newcomer before, and I remember a few years ago talking to our friends from Finland, and they said that after the presidency, when they did a sort of a list of what happened or what did not happen, they came to the conclusion that out of a 100% program that they put forward, 45% was actually carried out. The 65 remaining percent were the surprise elements that you have to be ready. And this is one thing that each presidency coming into that chair should have in mind. We remember the cases of Czech presidency, which was faced with Russian-Ukrainian energy crisis during the presidency. You can always be surprised. You can always find that there is a tsunami somewhere. If it's a political tsunami, sometimes even worse than the original one. The second element that needs to be taken into account when you prepare and when you actually run later on is something that is with us all the time. I will not dwell on it for too long, but it is something that all of you know very well, the Eurozone crisis, the Greek domino effect. Speaking today in front of you, waiting for the EU summit on the 23rd, I would not dwell too long. We will see what happens, but at least we know one thing, that the virus debt has to be curbed, and it is a political decision how to do it. We have a certain chain of countries that are under the cloud, I would say. Italy, of course, Portugal. The question would remain, and this is something that I am not an expert on. You are much better here. Do we put Cyprus on that list, considering the turbulence, at least, I would say, around the budget from a couple of days ago? But these are the relevant questions that every presidency, or indeed every country in the EU, has to ask itself. The mood itself is important. We study on a daily basis the opinion polls all over the world, practically in Europe, daily, as I said. When I read that the 75% of Germans are against pledging more money to the Euro rescue, and 44 start to think gently about returning to a Deutschmark, which is an interesting indicator in itself, you do have elements that make you worry. We look at it from a very particular perspective. Being a presidency of a country that is not a Eurozone member makes it, on one hand, much more difficult. Just to give you the inside gossip, we had a serious problem, for example, at the beginning of a presidency, chairing the ECOFIN. The Eurozone finance ministers were doubtful whether a non-Eurozone member should chair such a meeting, to which we answered that we have implemented some of the reforms about 10 years ago that most of the Eurozone countries haven't done yet until today. That is a good indication. For example, when I mentioned this, the indicator that I started with, the growth of sovereign debt versus the GDP, the Polish case, as I said, this year 53, but it is a constitutional barrier. No government, whatever political orientation in Poland, can surpass 60. If any government does that, the Prime Minister faces the Tribunal of State. This is a good mechanism to keep politicians in their place, not to throw around money, of course. That's why, in our case, going over 100% is practically suicidal for the government. And, you know, the fear of suicide is usually a very good fear to keep people alive. But the Eurozone as a problem is an interesting academic issue that one may pursue. I read the Financial Times a few days ago, the former British Minister Lord Owen proposing to set up a non-Euro group. That's an interesting, composed of UK, Sweden, Denmark and Poland, as a balance to the EU 17. He says EU 17 lack determination. The non-Euro group members have much better economic indicators. Perhaps we should gently close our eyes on the British statistics at this moment, but generally it's okay. This shows how difficult it is to assess the debate within the EU, because it goes on every level. And part of the job of a presidency is to at least monitor every possible interesting impulse. I'm not saying that Lord Owen's proposition is something that will be taken up further. Probably not, because it shows that that he is thinking of selecting parts of Europe, cutting it up into pieces. This is something fundamentally against our philosophy of how Europe should function. But it shows how it goes. External factors influencing the decisions and your position as a presidency, as our position as a presidency. I could mention something that is very obvious and known to all of us, the so-called Arab Spring effect. Look at it. I mean, this is something that we all read, that we all know, that we all experience. Cyprus is practically on the doorstep of the things that are happening in the North Africa. But try to, for a moment, to see that for a Central Eastern European country that has been preparing with the view of investing into a different EU policy, I will come to that in a moment, the Eastern Partnership policy, which is, together with Sweden, it's our baby, you would say. This is where we invested money and intellectual capital for years to try to make the eastern neighborhood of the European Union a pro-democratic one. It's not easy, as I will say in a moment, but this is our obvious area of our, let's say, mental development, Central Eastern Europe. Suddenly, as a presidency, we have to take care and invest into areas that are, today the world is a global village, of course, you can say, we don't go that much beyond our natural habitat. But after all, Libya or Tunisia or Syria are not natural areas of Polish political development. And at the same time, we have, when the events in North Africa happened, we have redeployed, so to speak. It was a major political decision out of necessity, because this is what is important for the EU, and that's where the presidency should work. As an example, last week I mentioned the Polish parliamentary elections. We brought a plane full of Egyptian and Tunisian NGOs to watch how the election is done. They will be doing it. They have to learn it. They have never done it before in the normal democratic sense. So this is a sample of things that we were doing, and not to mention the division of labor with High Representative Lady Ashton, the foreign minister. I'm not betraying any secret. The foreign ministers of Poland, Denmark and Cyprus have a working arrangement with Lady Ashton that during the trio, some of the jobs or some of the trips, some of the visits that she should be taking will be accomplished and taken over by the three foreign ministers of the trio countries. We have done that in early July, and the Polish foreign minister was the first EU minister to go to Benghazi. This was before Tripoli has fallen, representing EU, Catherine Ashton. Of course, the Arab Spring has many faces. And it's a question to all of us how it will develop. But one of the issues that is slowly creeping up, I am not saying that this debate is within the EU very vibrant, and it should be, is let's call it the Schengen debate, the debate on migrations. This is something that is facing us sooner or later. And as you very well don't have to go into details, but as you know and understand, not everybody is very keen on raising that issue in the European Union. We all know that we are aging. We all know that we need migrants. We don't know how to do it up to now. But this is also one of the, I would say, Stockholm program or Schengen package things that need to be taken into account. The presidency faces one more general problem in its course of action, and it is something that we call embarras de richesse. After Lisbon, Europe has become a much more multifacial institution. There is a wealth of institutions that have, through the Lisbon Treaty, a hold on forming the policies. Not to mention the Parliament, of course, is the newest arrival, so to speak, but its powers have grown tremendously. Presidency's necessity to cooperate with Parliament, we have only found out how important it is to be in the Parliament, to brief the MEPs, etc., etc. Then, of course, you have the Commission, the Member States, and the general view that everybody has, at least EU citizens have, that the decision-making process in the EU after Lisbon is slower than before. Perhaps the decisions to be made are more difficult. That's why we are slower. That would be a sort of a positive attempt of answering this question. But at least there is an obvious new role for a post-Lisbon presidency. The first trio investigated how it goes. The second trio still does the same. We are still, I think, in the learning mode, knowing that although not political but managerial, it's still very, very difficult. Having these things in mind, about a year ago we envisaged what we would want to put into the priorities of the presidency that would face European problems, and in a way the process was fairly simple. It is the answer to a question: what kind of Europe do you want? And we identified out of these many initial points 3 basic clusters of ideas. One is that we want a growing Europe, second that we want a secure Europe, and third that we want an open Europe. Let me say just a few words on each 3 concepts, because of course you feel just as I feel. It's easier said than done. But I think one of the things that the presidency should not escape from is trying not to be ambitious. Over-ambitious, definitely not. Ambitious, definitely yes. The growing Europe. This, of course, has to do with economy. The only way to prevent the second wave of crisis and the recession, according to us, is to stimulate those instruments like the internal EU market. That's why the Polish presidency is pushing for something that is called Single Market Act. It is a crucial legal framework for doing business in an unhindered way. Such instruments that guarantee growth. The idea, the Franco-German idea of recapitalizing the banks seems to be one step forward. It's only a partial solution. A discipline of the public debt is crucial. As I mentioned, I will mention it again because this is something that we are proud of. The 60% constitutional limit on debt is something that is useful. And some countries are introducing it. Italy is. France is debating it still in the upper house. We think also that, and this is something that actually will touch much more on our successors, in particular on Cyprus, and the multi-annual financial framework, which is a very nice word about EU budget or EU money, the crucial element that makes the whole thing go. In this debate, already initiated by the Commission, there are different views. We have, for obvious historical and civilizational reasons, I would say, somewhat different view than the net payers. We think if we diminish the budget or as I keep reading now, limit the coherence funds, for example. We shall cut off investment resources, and in effect we may face a rise of unemployment, and that is inevitably a course toward recession. The Polish position on the budget at this phase, this is the beginning of a debate, is that if we want to keep it as high as possible. The growth package is not the easiest one to put forward, because there are so many ideas that you are faced with simultaneously. But of course there are major institutions in the EU, the President of the EU included, who is going to speak this weekend on the 23rd on how do we break the deadlock. Presidency in this case is only a small part, let's be very frank, of the entire deal. Security, which I mentioned, relates to many areas, from food security to hard security. From our point of view, and this is something I guess that has become a very hot topic in Cyprus, the energy security is one of the priorities that we wish to push. We want to make Europe independent from outside sources, if possible, and dependent on each other. As I said again, easier said than done, but things need to be done. There is the energy chapter, so to speak, to be debated within the EU. We are working hard on that. On the margin of this, I think, and please treat this as a off the record issue. The carbohydrates issue of the Eastern Mediterranean is, of course, of interest to us. This is one of the potential providers of EU independence. Let's be very, very frank. And I regret to say that I think it has been mismanaged from the very start. I mean, some of my Cypriot friends tell me that the start goes back about 10 years ago, because this was the beginning where it was known that the Eastern Mediterranean possesses large deposits of gas. But even if we go only a year or two ago, I think that what could have happened is that the Eastern Mediterranean energy deposits could have become a platform of exchange of experiences, of exchange of financial visions for the future, and finally the platform that builds peace in that region, in more meanings than one, I would say. I think, unfortunately, we are past that phase. In politics, sometimes the words do more harm than the flying planes, and I am afraid that the words have been very harmful in the last months or so. One more sentence, perhaps, on that. The gas and oil seem to change people's perspective. There is something that I call the gas craze. It is not something that is indigenous to Cyprus in recent weeks and months. Just to point to the speaker himself, we have found a different kind of gas. It's called shale gas, the one in the rocks. And obviously there are economists who count how much an average Pole will get per head in the next 3 years. Our deposits are perhaps not as large as the Aphrodite field, but we talk of billions of cubic meters of shale gas as well. The Polish energy sheet is negative in the sense of that we have to buy much more than we produce. We have to buy about 70% of our needs. The contract is with Gazprom, who is a major provider, of course, in that part of Europe. The shale gas that will be operational, as far as I read the optimistic views, within the next 3 years, will reduce the dependency on the Russian pipe from 70 to 30%. So you can imagine that the gas craze is fully there. The final point is open Europe. Open Europe, of course, relates to issues of enlargement, in which the presidency shares some of the burden with DG Enlargement, that means Commissioner Fuller, and of course, High Representative. In matters dealing with trade policy, the presidency is still very robust and active. In others, after Lisbon, things have been taken over by other institutions. But as we read, or as you have read, the same as I, the recent progress reports on the candidate countries issued on October 12, I may try to give you the view that we have on the basic issue, whether we enlarge, how we enlarge. I'm not going to even risk answering when do we enlarge. This is another story. Of course, Polish position as a new member state. Please remember, we are baby brothers with Cyprus. We joined on the same day, the European Union. And our position is firmly that the enlargement perspective should be kept, because the perspective itself has, quote-unquote, civilizing values. It is something that we remember very vividly. One example, perhaps, is something that easily comes to my mind. The enlargement commissioner of the previous commission, whom we were doing most of the business with, a gentleman well known in Cyprus as well, Günther Verheugen, was the most hated German that ever stepped on the Polish soil in 2001, 2002. And as you can imagine, most of the media used the fact that he was a German even to enhance all the possible stories of Polish tragedy, and the German who is squeezing the last drop of blood out of this poor candidate country. Today, Günther Verheugen, I think, has about 5 honorary degrees in Polish universities, and he is an honorary citizen of about 6 Polish cities. This just shows how the perspective can change. What he made us, in the shortest possible version, what he made us as a candidate country do is to do our homework. The homework was blood, sweat, and tears, but it paid off. I just showed you the Polish economic parameters. This is part of the same story. If we hadn't done it then you pay the price of very difficult readjustment. You are like a child of a special care in a class. Nobody likes that. So Europe should remain open. The perspective should be vital for others. As you know, we will conclude the Croatian membership either within this year, or we shall pass that pleasure and honor to our Danish colleagues. Talks with Iceland are proceeding. This seems not to be the most of the difficult cases, although there are, I understand, questions that need to be answered by Iceland and by the EU itself. This leaves us with a debate and a process on 4 areas, which not only we identified, but everybody else has identified. These are things that we are, as a presidency, at present engaged in. 1, Ukraine. 2, Turkey. 3, Western Balkans. 4, a general view of the so-called Eastern EU neighborhood. Few words on each. We expect to conclude the association agreement with Ukraine in December, despite recent tiny, I'm emphasizing the word, and this is a hope that I express, tiny problems that we have. The postponement of President Yanukovych's visit to Brussels that was announced, my Ukrainian colleague will confirm today, I think. The postponement was for today. Yeah, is an obstacle that can be surpassed, and I say that we shall try to do it despite the fact that our position on Julia Tymoshenko trial is the same as the entire EU position. It is not a good outcome. And I let me say this, and I say this out of great friendship to Ukraine, to a country that, first of all, my entire family comes from, It comes from there, not only my father and my mother, but 10 previous generations as well. And the country that I have been to during my work in the Foreign Office on numberless occasions. I think that each country that looks to the EU should sooner or later ask itself a vital and basic question: what do we bring to EU? And then the second, but this is only the second, what will we get out of it? First is the input. That question is valid for every member. EU is a set of countries that do have certain rules of the game. You do not change them in any situation. This is a very difficult question on a national level. It's not easy to answer. It takes time, but it needs to be asked, and it needs to be answered. Second, of course, the famous issue, and I think I would not really dare to raise it, but Turkey is something that we all have on our mind. Let me say that I observe many reasons for which Turkey is reluctant to engage in accession negotiations. And not only because most of the chapters are blocked. No, I'm saying that there are reasons, political, social, cultural reasons, which slow down Turkish fervor for EU membership. And what I just said before is equally relevant to Turkey. It needs to ask itself and answer that very question. I also wish to say that I believe that the so-called threats policy that it's pursuing is totally counterproductive. Totally counterproductive. It makes it very difficult for us to maintain a dialogue with Turkey, and we do. Let me say that there is a certain, I would say even, although you may find it surprising, synergy between Poland and Turkey. We are going to celebrate next year 6 centuries of diplomatic contact with the Ottomans and the Turks. 6 centuries. That means that at least somebody in Europe knows his Turk. We do. It doesn't make it easier, because we do observe that there is an obvious cultural, political shift. I spent part of April in Ankara, and one of the questions that I asked to my Turkish partners was that this was before the elections in Turkey. So despite not understanding Turkish, I was staying up all nights watching television, the talk shows. But as you can imagine, after 5 hours of watching the language that you don't understand, you suddenly begin to understand everything. It just depends on the determination, especially if you want to know what's there. And after all, watching TV political debates is not that difficult. You more or less know what is the agenda. And speaking of the agenda, I was surprised that the EU agenda was not there. It was 10% of what they were talking about. This is telling. This shows how much within the public discourse EU is infused or not infused. And I'm saying these critical remarks despite the fact that I recognize, and we recognize very well, that EU and Turkey do have a number of shared interests, political and economic. Turkish economy is basically a pro-European economy. These are important elements which may in future prove productive. Area number 3 of enlargement, the Western Balkans, the Presidency, excluding the Croatian example, which is more or less settled, but taking the Croatian example as a European perspective for other countries of that region. The EU membership has a perspective of EU membership at the beginning of the talks does have, and again I speak from my own national experience, a transformative power. It does change, hopefully, societies as well, but at least the institutional structures, the economic structures of a given country. And let me say that there is, I know Balkans more or less well. I've been to to Kosovo a day before, or to Belgrade the day before the first bombs fell. We, at the time, Poland was holding the OSCE presidency, and this was the last mission of peace that the Western community was sending to Milosevic's government before the military campaign started. One of the most unforgettable visits that I remember. But we do see that the wounds of the war, because you have to say this pretty straightforward, the wounds of the war in that area are some slowly, some more still to stay, but healing. There is a process of approaching different goals, social goals. This is seen in Serbia. This is seen in Serbia, despite the problem that have come up recently with Kosovo. This is not so much seen in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is a problem, which is not so much seen in Albania, and it is not so much seen in my favorite country, because the name is always something that I like to say aloud, meaning Fyrom, of course. And I always have a problem of what do you call the citizens of Fyrom? They must be Fyromians, of course. We will, and for years we have, invested a lot as an example of transformation in the Balkans. This has been one of the areas in which Polish foreign policy was active. And during the presidency, we are doing exactly the same. Third and fourth element, and the last one, I said I hope I will not bore you, but I'm beginning to worry, so I will better draw to the conclusions. The recent Eastern Partnership Summit in September in Warsaw proved that most of our Eastern neighbors, I'm speaking here excluding Ukraine, are not ready for the in-depth structural reforms. As you know, the summit put forward a very clear message based on conditionality. You do your homework, we do our homework. Many leaders of it's usually called former Soviet republics, but it's an old-style terminology. Many leaders of that region do not understand that EU is much more than the provider of money. It is a provider of a civilizational security. And when they come to this, they will, I hope, come to a responsibility to react. I leave aside one more completely different case. Our neighbor in the east, Belarus, but here this is rather a tragic story. I don't want to say this is the Syria of the east, but there are equally worrying elements of repression against any democratic standards and against any people who say that they do not agree. The labor comes from members of opposition are full, and the plight of the opposition is very difficult. This is something that we need to work on for years to come. But as they say, totalitarian countries seem like a wall, but once they break, and there's no way of stopping that break. The target and project-oriented approach that we will do toward the Eastern Partnership country members, non-EU members that is, will be upheld and will be a long process. Please remember that from the EU financial point of view, this is one of the two major EU external policies. The second one, of course, is the Union for the Mediterranean. And despite the fact that the balance of payments goes heavily in favor of the Union for the Mediterranean, it is 2/3 for the south and 1/3 for the east. We are not going to knock on the door for more money. I think the money on our on our southern neighborhood that we need to spend is a well spent and invested money. This is the overview of the challenges of this presidency, of perhaps the next one, and may I say, optimistically, this is not optimistic, even Cyprus presidency may face very similar choices and challenges. And so as I would say, in my conclusion, managing the presidency is equally challenging as exercising political leadership of the past. Management seems to be now a skill of facilitating a compromise, but at the same time a skill in which a certain of your own ambitions need to be showed for. The challenges have grown considerably while the responsibility is shared between many. That's why we often criticize the EU for not taking full opportunities of performing as a leader. I think that this has to be looked in the perspective because of so many decision centers are there on the table. There is no single leader to tell me that black is black and white is white. We have to come to the shades of gray, but I believe that as the evening is setting in Cyprus, the shades of gray is the answer that I would, in a positive sense, give to the Polish presidency as well. Thank you very much for your attention.